Today, my guest is Dr. Derek R. Riddle. Dr. Riddle is an associate professor of teacher education at California State University Stanislaus and currently the single subject credential program coordinator. He received his doctorate degree in teacher education from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Prior to his appointment at CSU Stanislaus, Dr. Riddle taught middle school and high school English language arts in rural settings in Idaho and in urban settings in Las Vegas. He taught every grade from 7 through 12, teaching a range of classes from remedial to advanced placement classes and dual credit courses. He also served for a short time as an instructional coach. At CSU Stanislaus, Dr. Riddle mainly teaches general methods courses as well as literacy methods courses. His current research interests broadly span teacher education pedagogies and clinical experiences, teacher professional development and teacher leadership, educational policy regarding teacher recruitment and retention, and English language education. This conversation includes ideas which may challenge some beliefs commonly held among educators. With that in mind, I would like to open with a quote from the Greek philosopher Epictetus. "It is impossible for a man to learn what he thinks he already knows." I'm Jake Schulke, and this is the Grand Unified Podcast, a production of Links Learning Labs. To support us, please subscribe on YouTube and anywhere else you find podcasts. Now, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Derek R. Riddle. Really, I need, airline pilots have a checklist, their pre-flight checklist, make sure everything's working. I really need a pre-flight checklist for if I'm going to be engineering and producing this all on my own.
I'm just going to say, I think I'm just honored that you are doing this, that you're inviting me onto this, and I'm good. I'm good with the process.
I'm so happy for you to be here when it's a brand new project, and it'll probably just be an expensive hobby, at least for a long time. But I think it's so important. Like I talked about in your class, there's so much information that exists, even though, like we talked about already, the peer-reviewed literature on things like assessment and grading is a little scant. But there are books and there's podcasts and audiobooks out there, things that you can get a hold of. And it was years into becoming a new teacher until basically like the last year that I found the time to read a book that I wanted to read and discovered that digesting information through audio it's available. It's out there. If you find the right books that are on audiobook, if you find the right podcast out there with interviews with the right people that are talking about the right topics, it's out there. And so for new teachers that are talking about things like assessment and grading that really don't know what to do, so they're by default going to do what they've experienced as a student probably.
Right.
To put some information out there that you as a professor in teacher education could use, like, hey, if you want to start thinking about your grade book before you do your student teaching or while you're doing it, maybe give this a listen. And people could encounter by accident and colleagues could share, because there's ideas out there that, like you go and talk to somebody that's been teaching for 10 or 20 or 30 years, they've never re-examined their grading or how they're assessing or what their grade book means. Like, what do you mean? What does it mean? And you ask them about the validity and the reliability of their grades, and it's like you're speaking gibberish to them. So while this is in its infancy and it's a project I really believe in, I appreciate you being here on my third interview with anybody ever to talk about something that's a big deal. It's a big deal.
Yeah, for sure.
And, and thank you again for letting me come to your class 6 months ago and talk. And I'm really glad we watched that video with that student, or at least glad that I watched it. Because it woke up in me some realizations. And I remember having that student's reaction, having to in the back of my head say thank you and move on to the next student. Let's not have the discourse now. Let's not have the back and forth, because that doesn't work either. To talk to somebody, whether they're not even a teacher yet or they've been teaching for decades, to say, well, here's why you're wrong. That doesn't work at all.
And I think too, speaking to that, I've learned, and I think from different experiences with working with different folks, and I'll just say, I want to be careful too, like that I'm not pigeoning certain people. That's what I'm going through in my head, but just, I think I have found that most people, like you said, they don't like being told they're doing things wrong. And I think for any teacher that listens to this, anybody that's invested in, hey, I want to change my practice around anything, just to give yourself grace to say, no, you're not doing anything wrong. You probably believed in what you're doing. More than likely, what you are doing is having some positive outcome in some way, shape, or form on your students and on the community. All we're suggesting is, if you want to potentially have a vision for a different outcome, let's set that vision. If you do it this way, this might be the outcome. And if that's an outcome you value, then let's do the work to get to that outcome. yes, there are some things that happen in education that are probably really harmful. We need to just stop. I think at this point, the grading practices that people are doing could have some of that, but I think they work and they may motivate some students. But we're talking large scale. Let's get to a practice that probably is really a best practice instead of just a, decent practice.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we could talk for hours about the history of our current education system, where these grading practices came from, and maybe I'll do that another day. But we haven't really changed how we assess and grade students in the history of this country's education system, and there's no standardized model for doing it in the most effective, most valid,
Correct.
most reliable way that has the best outcomes for students.
Right.
And a lot of us believe that we know what is best for us and for, quote, our classroom.
Right.
And there's a degree of truth to that, because there's your specialized content area or your population of kids you're teaching, but it seems, looking at all the literature that's available and all the evidence that people have gathered through changing their teaching practices and doing legitimate research on it, that there are already some best practices that we could employ.
For sure. So
we talked earlier about just making that step to evaluate your own assessment and grading system.
Yep. Yeah. So I think, so first and foremost, that's it. It's just, maybe we even start with a belief, right? Or a practice, right? And so I think that's what's helpful, because you don't know what you don't know, right? And so once you know, then that's where I think the first step comes in. Read some of the things you're talking about, like the stuff that's out there in relation to conversations around grading. That's the first start, right? And look at, what am I doing? What are people saying might be, again, a different way, without adding too much value to say a better way, but a different way of doing my grading. And so I look at one of those practices and this is one that I think a lot of teachers probably implement. I'm looking at the one that is probably the big one, just things like, in secondary world, at least, I'm gonna give students late points, or if students don't turn something in, I'm giving them an F because it's missing, or zeros. Any of those kinds of things that teachers start doing, maybe we need to re-examine that. Why are we doing that? Right. And I think it's always interesting to me when I say, if I even just say teachers, let's just even go back to like the late work, a student turned something in late. And now I'm taking points off that assignment because they turned it in late. Well, why? Why are you doing that? And the argument is, well, because they turned it in late and I'm trying to teach. And then let's keep that conversation going. Teach what? Really, as we pare that down, what we're teaching is behavior. So we're teaching non-cognitive types of things. Cognitive meaning the standards are these knowledge and skills that we're trying to help students learn and understand and be able to demonstrate. Now we're actually grading more of a softer skill, which is important in academics and professional life, to be responsible, to turn things in a timely way. But it's not one that we've been charged as teachers to grade. We've been charged to grade accurately and reliably what students can do and what students know based on the state standards and the curriculum that we're supposed to be teaching. We're not actually charged to teach behavior and responsibility. Mm-hmm. And so, but we do. And I think it's kind of the carrot to the stick method. Well, I can't accurately grade a student who turns something in late, because now that puts more on me, or there's a plethora of different things that teachers go through. But so we're essentially just saying, well, I'm going to take points off to try to get that student to recognize that the real lesson that I want them to learn is to be compliant and to be more, I guess, behaviorally and socially acceptable to what the professional norms are for a career or beyond, schooling. But again, my challenge to that would say, okay, but if we're going back to what a grade should represent, right? A grade should represent what a student knows, what they're able to do according to state standards and curriculum. And a student turns that assignment in late, and they, on that assignment, demonstrated that they have learned and mastered the content learning goal that you have for them. I think it would be a little bit problematic to take 20% or 30% or any percent off that grade that would taint the report of what that student knows and is able to do. And so I think that's a first step. I think it's really looking at some of these beliefs and saying, okay, they're asking me to do that, I don't do that, and really start asking, well, why do I need to do that? And why do I need to change my practice here? And talking with people like me or others that are writing books, doing podcasts, doing the work, we can walk you through some of that and say, this is why. Because this will just say, I would be cautious to say, even with the work that I read and other researchers out there saying, here are the practices that you should do, without actually having some unpacking. And so really, honestly, I hope there's instructional coaches that listen to this kind of stuff, because that's where their work's going to be so important. Let's sit down and yes, there's a practice, but let me go through why this practice is important. Yeah. And the more we do that, I think teachers are going to start to hopefully buy into, okay, I can see that. And I can see why that's an important thing I need to start doing.
I completely agree. And like through the types of questions that an effective instructional coach learns to ask, because they learn to teach very Socratically. Like, don't give any answers, just ask a lot of good questions.
Yeah.
Get people thinking. That really, for me, was the path to knowing that I wanted to change how I was assessing and grading.
Yeah.
When I read the Joe Feldman book, when I read Grading for Equity, and then read some other books like Ungrading, Susan Blum. Yep. Is it Blum or Blum?
I think it's Blum.
Okay, Susan Blum. The Ungrading, that's a great book too. Yeah. And there are several others out there in books that mention grading in a chapter or something. And then I started to really think, like, what the heck is my grade even for? What does it mean? Yeah. And right now, the way I'm doing it, it's so unscientific, which just felt icky.
Yeah.
Just felt like I have this tool that I'm supposed to be measuring what's happening inside someone's mind, and I'm not measuring it at all.
Yeah.
Because I have a kid can learn no science in my class and they can get an A, and they can learn all of the science and get an F, and that is preposterous.
Yeah. Truly.
And it just kind of depends on their attitude and their behavior and their attendance and their work habits and all these other things that have nothing to do with how much science they've learned or learned how to apply and demonstrate, like you said.
Yeah.
And that, being lucky enough to be in a place where, okay, I know it's going to take a little bit of time investment and thought investment to redesign things, and even to do it like mid-year, like do it between a first and a second quarter, like that felt icky.
Yeah.
it felt precarious is what it felt like. Like there's, to change grading practices in the middle of the year, like to rewrite your syllabus in the middle of the course, that could go terribly.
Yeah.
Especially with highly engaged parents that are going to question you on it, it could go absolutely terribly.
100%.
And so it's maybe not something I'd recommend to everyone to do it that way, but definitely to think about your grades and what they mean. Because since doing this, I've had conversations with colleagues at grading time. We all, the cliche huddle around the water cooler. There's no water cooler, but we go to each other's classrooms to, have a soda pop after work and talk it out. Some of us have ice cream and things in our freezer and sit and lament about the day. And, grading comes around and we talk about, oh my God, I have this many Fs. I'll hear that from a colleague and then ask them like, well, that's a lot. You have that many students that have learned zero content from you?
Right.
Well, no. Well, that's what an F would mean, right? Is they're not learning anything.
Right.
They're not learning any of whatever your content area is. And they're like, well, no, they just, they don't turn stuff in and they don't. Well, how much of your content do they know how to do, or can they apply at a high thinking level? And they don't have a good answer for that question.
Right.
And I think for a teacher to ask themselves that, like you're saying, like examine your own beliefs and your own practices. Like, what is your grade supposed to do?
Yeah.
And if it's not measure learning, where do you go from there, Derek? Like,
yeah, and I think this is why I'm so grateful for the foundational work that's being done right now. While we talked prior, the literature on empirical studies researching grading practices is limited and scant. It's there, and what I think is there is, as we're talking, I think the mirror is there. I think there is a mirror where, as I mentioned too before, like a practice like don't take off late points, or don't grade on a curve, or any of these kinds of things. That's your mirror, right? So as a teacher, you don't have to, because they don't. I think about myself as a pre-service teacher educator. I'm teaching my students how to grade, but man, go back 20 years. I don't think that was even a conversation in pre-service education. I don't even know if assessments were, to be honest, but just talking about that particular piece was not something that new teachers were being trained on. And you, again, learn by the fly, learn by trial and error. And unfortunately, these were kind of cultural existing practices that people have just done for years without ever examining it. Now we have a mirror. So put the mirror up and look at yourself in that mirror and start asking yourself, is this what I want to look like? I hope that the answer is not, I'm good with that picture in the mirror and I'm complacent with that. I hope that there's some scars or some things that might make you go, I think I can improve that. And so that would be my first suggestion is let's look at these beliefs. And again, I don't know if you have any kind of show notes, attaching that to the show notes and say, here's the mirror.
Yeah.
Put the mirror up and take a look at the mirror, and then seek out people that are doing the writing the books that you've read that are maybe unpacking a little bit more, or find people like myself or others that are doing that unpacking work and say, okay, I'm seeing myself in the mirror and I'm seeing that I'm doing something that's incongruent or inconsistent with what others are saying, but I don't know why. And so let's unpack the why.
Totally agree. And yeah, I'll put anything in the show notes that we can find helpful, like these books we're talking about, the paper you have out right now. I'll link all that in the show notes, so people, if you want to start going through that thought process, having your own little idea lab of what is my grade supposed to do, what is it supposed to mean, then people can hopefully do that, because so much of this stuff is available in audiobooks and podcast interviews with the authors, and there's great stuff out there.
100%. Yeah.
So if somebody has then looked at their grading and they've decided it doesn't do what I want it to do, or it doesn't mean what I want it to mean, and they're ready to make a change, but it seems daunting. Then what?
Start small, right? So start with, if I guess I'm just trying to think of a hypothetical scenario, but start small. Start with whatever makes sense. If you're currently grading students and your idea is, hey, my students, let's just go back to the late points. My students are turning stuff in late, and I'm using, this grade deduction to motivate them to turn things in. Stop, right? Don't do that anymore. Now, this brings up the good question, but it works, right? So I'm getting students to turn their stuff in on time. And honestly, I'm going to make an argument here. I don't think you're really getting everybody to turn their stuff in on time. But maybe in your mind, hey, this seems to be working. I seem to, at least compared to some maybe imaginary or perceived alternative, I'm getting more students to turn their stuff in on time, or at least I'm quote unquote teaching responsibility. But I think that's the point. We are supposed to teach students to be well-rounded individuals. We are supposed to teach responsibility and support parents in their role in doing that. And I think there's a lot of philosophies in education about that. Is that the parent's job? Is that the teacher's job? And some teachers will say, and again, erroneously in my opinion, the parents aren't doing it, so I guess I have to do it. Or whatever, right? I think it's both. I think there are certain contexts in the home where parents are going to teach their children life lessons and responsibility and those social skills and social emotional learning type of things in the home that are valid for what's going on in the home. And I think there are certain skills that are different in school that teachers can teach. And so I think it's a shared responsibility. So instead of grading students on that and reporting out to parents, by the way, this is the social skills of your students, I think there's ways in which you can do that report. We just don't do it with grades. Grades are supposed to be for, again, standards and content. So then use classroom management. If students aren't turning things on time, what does classroom management research say? Build a relationship. What's going on? Why aren't you turning things on time? Maybe they lack time management skills. Maybe they lack some of those soft skills that they need to be taught so they can successfully meet deadlines. How many of us fall and not meet deadlines all the time, right? And we have to learn to manage our own time, even as adults. So I think it's just teaching that and helping students to learn that, and then reporting it out in a different way. If a student is not meeting behavioral expectations in your class, then you would, I don't want to use the punitive measure like I'm punishing that student, but there'd be a natural consequence. Hey, I'm going to make you stay after class. You're going to have to work on this because I need you to get this done. Or, hey, I'm going to have a phone call conversation with parents because we need to figure out how to work your schedule. And maybe there's even some more equity issues there. The student's not turning something on time because they've got a lot going on outside the classroom, where this particular assignment that you're assigning and expecting them to turn in for homework, they're just not able to do. But again, I think it just comes back down to it's a conversation, not a grade. I don't think a grade does anything to change what I don't think grading a student based on behavior is going to actually change the behavior.
I think we know that. I think we know that from the research that already exists, and there's more still going on. There's a great book, Self-Driven, it's up here somewhere on my shelf, The Self-Driven Child, and it's all about motivation. And I'll link that one too. And the research cited in there shows that you really can't influence a child's behavior very much with extrinsic motivation, especially when it's abstract, which a grade very much is,
right?
Especially to a kid who's transitioning from like elementary to middle school to high school, that grades are kind of new, and being assessed in this way is very new. You really can't influence them that way. What ends up influencing them is just adults being mad at them. And so you're using the grade as a way to make their parents mad at them, which doesn't seem very effective.
I think it really just comes back down to that conversation. If a student, there could be so many reasons why the student is turning that in late. And once you address the real source of the issue, I imagine they turn things in on time. Whether that's I've got home issues, I've got time management issues, or I have motivational issues. I just don't want to do it. And I'm struggling to muster up the motivation to want to do it. And by the time I'm motivated to do it, deadline's passed, or, oh, now my grade's suffering, and maybe that's my motivation. But again, and I almost gave an argument for someone to say, well, then my grade's suffering, but the grade doesn't suffer because I gave late points. The grade suffers because at this point, there is a deadline. I've made a deadline in my class. I expect you to turn this in on time. And now my grade book shows that it's missing. And that would reflect, if we're talking the law of averages, your grade, right? Now, I didn't give you a failing grade or a 0 or any of those other, we can talk about all those beliefs, but I think that's where teachers have to grapple with this. But I think there is a way to communicate to a student, you did not pass this assignment. That's what's been hard for me, even as a practitioner. What happens as I'm trying to more accurately and reliably grade students, and the accurate report is they're failing? Mm-hmm. So let's go back to your conversation with your peer who's, hey, I got all these failing grades, and maybe it really truly is they're just not getting it.
Yeah.
That's a hard pill for an educator to swallow and a parent to swallow.
Yeah. To know, like,
and I say that only because I think there may be some implicit kind of underlying logic where someone could come back and say, hey, it sounds like what you're just asking me to do is just bolster the grade for kids, right? And you're not really saying that you want a reliable grade. You just want a grade that doesn't get us in trouble or doesn't have a bunch of kids failing your class. That's not what we're saying at all.
No,
we want it to be reliable.
The opposite.
And so there may be times where you might strengthen your grade book and your grading practices, and your students are performing as they should be. They're performing really well. But on the flip side of that, there are going to be students in your class that aren't performing well, and you should also report that.
Definitely. I had this conversation with a colleague in my department recently. We were in our collaboration meeting, our weekly collaboration meeting, and we were talking about grading because we want to all be grading in a similar fashion in the coming academic year. And my colleague said, yeah, I tried what you're doing where the grade is just the summative assessments, and the kids can't pass the test. So they were all failing. So I just went back to what I was doing before, where every little daily compliance activity has points.
Right.
And I tried to start that conversation and say, well, what do you mean they can't pass? What does that mean? Do they know the information? Are they failing because they don't understand it, or they can't perform the performance task that they're supposed to be able to do with it?
Sure.
Or is the test not accessible to them? Is there a language barrier? Is there some kind of, could you give them an option for expression if you think that they do know it and can express it through this medium?
Yeah.
And that conversation was really hard to have. Like I felt clumsy. I felt like I did not know what to say or do.
Yeah. But I think you were saying all the right things and you're asking the right questions, because I'll just give an example from my current practice. I was experimenting with a new content curriculum, a new methodology for teaching the content that I've taught for teacher educators over the past, or teacher pre-service candidates for the past 5 years. But I was like, it's just my assessment's not doing it. It's not really demonstrating, at least to me, that students have mastered this skill. So I tried a new assessment and it failed miserably. And so now here we are at the end of the semester, I have to go report grades and they failed. Well, that's not fair to them. And so I just omitted the grade, right? And so I just reported more qualitative feedback and said, hey, here's where you're at. Obviously, you're a teacher candidate that's going to become a teacher, and you're going to continue to grow in this profession. I'm not going to punish you by, hey, you didn't meet the goal based on my, sorry, invalid assessment here. Mm-hmm. But at least I can say what I saw was you did these things really well, and there's some things here you need to work on. At least take that feedback and carry that to your career. But I just omit the grade. And I think that's fair and equitable too.
Absolutely, especially if you're giving qualitative feedback.
Yeah.
We know that qualitative feedback actually causes students to have a metacognitive response, to learn more about their learning and understand what they don't get yet, and actually want to go back and improve.
Yeah.
And try encountering the material a different way, to restudy it, to relearn it, to come back and do a retake. But as soon as we couple a number or a rating with that they become very detached from that feedback.
Yeah. And to go back to that colleague of yours, I think it's natural, right? It's, again, that's safe. That's what's worked. That's allowed me at the end of the day to feel pretty good. And I think the measure there is that my students are not all failing my class, and whatever the measure, and I'm just imagining, I'm going to go back to giving all these assignments that eventually will, in the law of averages, shape everything out, and I can go, oh, my students, have a bell curve or whatever the case may be. I think I would just ask and invite people to rethink, again, what's the purpose of a grade?
Yeah.
And so if students are failing, then there's, like you're asking, lots of good questions behind that. Is it the assessment? Is the assessment the cause of them not being able to demonstrate the knowledge and skills that I believe I taught them well? What did I not teach them well? Which, if that grade comes back, or if that question comes back, I've done all these different things and I didn't teach them well, and that's why they're not learning. I need to go use that data now and that report to teach them again. But to go back to a faulty system of I'm going to do things in the way that I've always done things, to then skew that grade, doesn't really help anybody. It doesn't give you the data that you need to move forward. And that's what I, again, encourage you to not, or encourage anybody, not you, to just not default to things because it is what works or what always feels good, because we're finding, again, that mirror, it doesn't work. It's going to give you a skewed report, and that skewed report's not going to help advance learning, which is what we're trying to do.
Right. And the psychological effects it can have on kids too.
Sure.
I listened to a great interview with Simone Yates. She's a roboticist.
Okay.
And like an engineer inventor, and has a YouTube channel where she makes like pointless contraptions. And she had the subreddit shitty robots. Okay. And really cool. She was a college dropout. She's a physics major that dropped out of a prestigious. I think if I recall, she like went and studied physics at an Ivy League school for like a year and dropped out. But I could be wrong about that. But she talked about her experiences with grading in like secondary education, and transitioning from grades not really, and kids in elementary school don't really experience their grades in the same way you start to in secondary.
Right.
And she said as soon as my grades started to have, and she's not from the US. She said as soon as my grades started to have a number or a letter attached to it, it felt like a stamp, it felt like a label, it felt like I was being assessed as to my worth or my worthiness. And man, that like really hit home for me.
Yeah.
Like, and she's a brilliant, successful person.
Yeah.
And grading caused her to like detach from school and the education system.
Yeah.
That's remarkable to me.
Well, and I was fortunate I worked at a high school where I was asked by my principal to be a part of a committee that said, hey, let's re-examine our grading practices. And it was a sad experience to go to teachers and colleagues of mine. And maybe it's one of those, I wasn't a prophet in my own land, but to try to have these conversations and people just not wanting to have the conversations and feeling like everything's fine. And to bring this, as you say, the psychological impact of kids to the table to say, well, let's just think of a hypothetical student, which rhetorically, I wasn't really thinking of a hypothetical student. I was painting the picture of a student that we all had and that we all encountered, and just made it a hypothetical situation of, here's the student, especially in high school and secondary world, where we have a structure of semesters and quarters and averages, and really in the end, this is the grade that matters, and this is the grade that's going on a transcript, and this is the grade that's going to make decisions for your future. So you have a kid, hypothetically, who bombed his first quarter. I mean, just if we're going off a 100-point scale in the 100 percentage system, they got a 22, 18, anywhere between like an 18 to 22% in their grade for that first quarter. And then in the second quarter, they seem to all of a sudden get 86, 88. And you put those averages together. If you have first quarter's 45%, second quarter's 45%, maybe there's a final in there, a 10% final, and then that accumulation then gives them the semester grade, which then gives them a high school credit and allows them to make forward academic progress. You take that 18% and combine it with that 86%, they're just not passing that semester. So that's 18 weeks of basically instruction that they're going to have to repeat. And without ever just questioning why. Why did that student get that 18%? And so I'm bringing this to the table. What's going on? Like, why? My first question would be, why did he get an 18% in first quarter and do really well second quarter? Well, you find out this kid in first quarter, his parents got a divorce. He's now having to go live with grandma. Mom's got to try to figure out work. He's got younger siblings. So he's coming home and his academic life is starting to struggle because he can't do homework a lot. He can't focus on school because he comes home from school and has to focus on siblings. And sometimes he might not even go to school because he's got to focus on the siblings. Now, second quarter, things got a little bit better. Mom got a job. There's some more stability, able to maybe find someone to watch those younger siblings while then older sibling can go to school and be more successful and focus on his studies. So equity-minded, like we're looking at a kid who was really struggling to be successful in school, and we just didn't provide him any supports. So I bring that to the table hoping to tell my colleagues, can we see that maybe changing our grading practices would allow this student to have some hope? That while I'm struggling, I had the right supports, the right scaffolds, and that I wasn't going to be punished because of non-cognitive factors like attendance and or just life circumstances. But my colleagues looked at me and said, well, that was his problem. And that's hard. That's a hard pill to swallow. And so I understand this work that we're doing, and even people might listen to say, yeah, I agree with that. And that's where I'm going to say, maybe you need to rethink what you believe. And if that's how you feel about kids and the way that the system is shaping kids, I'm going to be bold and say, I don't know if the education system is one that you should be serving in, because it's not fair. That's not what we should be doing to kids.
Totally agree. Do you mind if we visit that topic for a second?
Yeah.
People that want to go into teaching. You talk to a lot of people that want to be a teacher.
Yeah.
Because they love kids.
Yeah. Well.
And they've experienced children whom they love.
Yeah.
And they might even like being around some children some of the time.
Yeah.
But don't really yet. They're yet naive to what the job fully entails.
Sure.
And the idea of loving kids and even loving teaching and even loving working with kids that have problems, whose lives are, not the cleavers, that there's still a lot more to it and a lot more to know. And it doesn't seem to me that teacher candidate programs expose candidates to that sufficiently.
Yeah, enough for sure.
What would you say about that?
Yeah, and it's one that's been a topic of interest of mine. So I'm finding the more I'm aware of that, that it starts from the beginning. So we're doing admission interviews, for example, and I'm going to start asking some of those questions. Not just, hey, why do you want to be a teacher? Oh, that's cool. But really honing in on what's the answer. And so what I'm finding, just anecdotal pattern, there are some candidates that will approach and say, when I ask the question, why do you want to be a teacher? I love my content. I love teaching content. I love science. I love English. I love math. I just think and people have told me I'd be really good at explaining that to people. And maybe they've even had some experiences where they have explained it to people and it just made sense to them. And there's obviously some intrinsic drive there to say, this is cool. I feel somewhat powerful that I have an ability to make content make sense to people. But I find that those people then, when they encounter students where it doesn't make sense, or they have some other, again, barriers, whether that's cognitive, whether that's, cultural or whatever, cultural meaning just cultural capital, right? Students that are coming to school without, I don't even want to speak to that as a deficit lens, but just students that would need extra scaffolds and extra support, or even just a different approach. That when that driver, I love when content makes sense to students, but it's not making sense to most of the students that are sitting in the seats in front of me, then the motivation starts to crash and those people don't stay in the profession. Whereas the response that I hear from a candidate that says something like, I really love kids, right? I really love working with young people, and I just think they're quirky and I think they're fun. And, I think I could use English to help them find their purpose in life. Or, I think when I look at the fact that kids are going out into the world and they don't have a good mathematical understanding of taxes or whatever, and I want to use math to help them be successful in so it's the flipping. It's content's no longer first, kids are first. And when kids become first and content becomes the way I support kids to be their best selves, those people stay in the profession longer. So I'm trying to find those people. And if you're one of those people right now where you're thinking, well, I really enjoy content, and you have kids second, maybe, again, it's time to start rethinking some things about either the profession or just, hey, I do want to be a professional, but maybe I do need to work towards changing my focus to, I want to focus on kids and use content as my secondary focus.
How do you draw in more of those types of candidates?
That's the question of the day. I honestly don't know.
In a teacher shortage already.
Right.
How do we find people that understand what teaching is and want to do it?
Yeah, I think it really, if we want to speak from a policy perspective and even from a community of education perspective, I think we need to do a better job at exposing early candidates, pre-service candidates, to really quality early field experiences, not ones where they step into a classroom and sit in the back and watch, but they really have some experiences where they talk with people about teaching, about beliefs, about what's going on in their mind, about, the passions that they have for kids. They're in classrooms where they see that kids first, content second, and the culture of that classroom and what that's like, and then have someone right alongside them to unpack that.
Yeah.
This is why that's happening. This is why this class feels good, because this is the focus. Without that, we're going to continue to have people coming in with those two divergent perspectives. And I think it's okay for someone to have an early field experience and say, oh, it's not about content. And you know what? I don't know if I really want to do this profession. And we catch them early. It's just it's not for me. And that might exacerbate the shortage, but I'd rather exacerbate the shortage, and I would rather exacerbate the shortage than have poor teaching.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would say the same thing from a self-centered perspective.
Yeah.
As having been a student who detached from education for a long time, starting in my adolescence. I wish I had more teachers that were just great.
Yeah.
I only remember a couple of them.
Right.
Which means the rest were like, maybe average.
And you can talk to any student. I mean, even my students currently, right, who are adults and are going to college because they want to learn certain things about their career. Every time I ask them about feedback, it's never, man, you're just a great professor who taught me so much about teaching. And that's there. Mm-hmm. And I think there you have students too will say the same thing. I really enjoyed science because of your efforts. But most of the time when we hear positive feedback from students about their teachers, they cared. There was some manifestation of they cared about me as an individual, and they cared about where I was at.
100%.
And they really just wanted to help me be my best self.
I've been thinking about this as far as like people I could talk to, and conversations I could share with potential teacher candidates or existing teachers, whatever. Because I was out having a beer with some friends last week and talking about work with a buddy who's not in education, and we were talking about teachers, and he remembered the name of a teacher, and he's in his mid-40s, this guy, and he remembered the name of a teacher from like middle school or high school, and remembered the posters on the wall in the classroom, and remembered in detail conversations they had had. And I was like, man, even if you learned none of their content area, that was a great teacher.
Yeah, for sure.
Because at you as an adolescent struggling with all the things that all of them do no matter what,
yeah, and
then some, depending on their situation, like that teacher connected with you.
Yeah.
And ultimately, if you can't do that, they're not going to learn the content anyways.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I want to, if you don't mind, I was going to go back to just a comment with assessment and grading that I think is important with all of this. You know, I was fortunate in my grad studies. I don't know, I was just say fortunate in the sense that I studied a topic early on that I thought was pretty interesting, and it really dealt with educational history. And besides the fact that I do a lot of this curriculum stuff, and I love good practices, and I want to learn how teachers can teach better, and that's really a driver for me in my research. I have a huge interest in policy and how policy shapes and impacts the educational system. Mm-hmm. And so I did a kind of a quasi, I wouldn't even say a literature review, but more just a conceptual analysis of the history of education at a certain point in the American education system. And it's really interesting for me in the argument that I posed, and people may have looked at it differently, maybe even historians would have looked at it differently, but I looked at it from this sense of 1983. And there was probably a lot going on even before 1983, but at 1983, we have this report that comes out, A Nation at Risk. And that report essentially claims that the educational system in the United States is falling behind the global educational system. That Russia's launching certain things, we're behind in scientific innovation, and really we need to do something about it, because our educational system is not producing the kind of people that seems to be the kind of people that are being produced around the world. And so this report comes out that calls for accountability in education. Now, I'm also going to say, in my opinion, I don't think that report was accurate. I think that there was probably a lot of great things happening in education. I think that we were producing very innovative thinkers. I think that just like in any system, there's someone that might catch on to something and have some small scale data and then make a large generalizable claim that may not really hold ground to every context and every situation within an American educational system. So from there, what I see is the federal government, and this is not a rant against the federal government, but I see a educational system in America that's run by individual states. Now I see more of a federal reach from 1983 on. I see more presidents talking about education, more about what we're going to do with education and how we're going to make sure that education serves the general population in the nation. And you can see it over time. You have different presidents convening in different ways and having different conversations about this. Again, this 1983 report that just spurs the conversation all the way up to 2001, where you finally get the president that says, we're going to do something about it. And when you get No Child Left Behind. And from there, I think I look at that and I see this argument of everybody essentially looked at education and said, we're not doing a good job. We need to hold students and teachers accountable for making sure that learning is happening in schools so that we can ultimately accomplish the goal of meeting, nationwide aims and whatever that might be. And again, that's always in flux and always changing. But what I find interesting in that whole conversation is never once did we go back and say, well, do we have any other data about how students are performing in school? We went off a 1983 report, and it was just a conversation that continued to get brought up in different councils at a federal level over and over and over again until finally said, well, based on that one report, we need to do something about it, and let's make a law where we have now really stringent school accountability. So I envision a world when we trust teachers more. And I think that starts with this conversation. I think it starts at the pre-service level. It starts with what you're talking about with your colleagues at the in-service level, where we're really challenging each other to say, are we, as a public institution, accurately and reliably sharing with the public how our students are performing against the learning standards that we are being asked to help those students meet? And if we could do that, I envision a world one day where we can make the argument where we don't have these high stringent accountability assessments anymore, which really are driving a lot of teachers out of the field, that are making students hate school. And we could just get back to learning, which would be awesome.
Absolutely. I know the students lose a lot of class time to standardized testing, benchmarking, all this data collection. Do you think that since 1983, since the oversight of education has become increasingly influenced from a federal reach, do you think that has made things worse?
Oh, for sure. And I appreciate, even when I go back to, you hear presidents say this, and I'm going to be mindful to not speak to certain presidents, but just that, presidents will say things like, well, I'll say it. President Obama was pretty good about coming in my opinion, and saying, we're testing too much. We need to rethink this. But there's still a language being said. So I'm going to work with departments of education across the state too, which in that phrase, what he's saying is, I'm going to withhold federal money until the states do what I think they should do. So it's this highly politically charged field that we're in.
Yeah.
And I think at the end of the day, minus that context, which I think my pre-service candidates, I try to explain to them that context. I hope all teachers recognize that you're working in a very highly charged political field. But at the end of the day, close your door and do these practices that really benefit kids. And then find others to do it, and do it as a school and do it as a community, and serve your community well. And hopefully, after enough trust is built back up in public education, maybe we can allow that same federal government or those same state governments that seem to want to constantly impose their philosophies and their stringent accountability measures on education to say, no, actually, these are highly trained and educated professionals, and we're going to let them do their job.
Absolutely. It seems that with broader and broader, with the government feeling increasingly responsible to maintain and improve the quality of education, in a bureaucratic system that seems to lend to things being assessed in manners that one can put on a spreadsheet, and that takes the individualization out of it to a great degree, which we should be looking at data and analyzing what's going on, but we should also be looking at why, and looking at teaching as a social science and a cognitive science, which we examine through qualitative data a lot of the time. We look at case examples.
Yeah.
So I think your idea of, well, let's manage up, let's influence it from the bottom up, do what works in your classroom, and even if you meet a little bit of pushback, because once your school becomes a school that is assessing and grading the right way, and the grades you're giving kids actually start to match their standardized assessment scores, and they're good, they're better than a lot of schools that are similar to you, that will start to be looked at.
Sure.
Because people in government will go, hey, we have this community school that's doing really well.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah.
And they'll look at it.
Sure.
It will happen.
And I'll say here's a positive example of that, where, my son now, two of my sons are in elementary school, and I go to the parent-teacher conference that they hold once or twice a year. I think in this case, it was the one that they're going to have for a year, just to kind of, I think there was actually other times, but it's the one that I decided to go to.
Okay.
And being mindful as the work that I do with, now I'm having a conversation with this teacher about academic progress, which we're going to now talk grades. And her laying out for me, here's my grade report as the teacher. Here are the measures that I've used against, again, these learning standards. I think they do it much better in elementary than we do it in secondary, and even in higher ed. But they say, look, here it is. Here are the learning targets. Here are the standards. Here are the things the state expects me as a public educator to teach. And now I'm giving it to you as the parent, and I'm showing you, here's how I've measured how your student is doing or your child is doing against those standards. And so she showed me that. And fortunately, my son was doing really well. But the gremlin of me and the critical side of me that says, I don't know if I can trust that report, knowing all the stuff that I do with grading practices. Mm-hmm. So interestingly, in this conversation, she kind of reluctantly said, well, and we also have this other measure that the district has asked us to give your child. Now we're talking state accountability assessments. And really, this is more like a district assessment, but it's still because the state's saying we need some external measurement and some accountability. We don't trust that initial report the teacher just gave me. So let me now show you that report of how your student is performing against these standards. And I was so grateful that they were exactly the same. They were completely congruent. So what she told me on that report was accurate and it was reliable based on that other kind of corroborated external measure. Now, the sad side, I mean, that's the happy side of the story. The sad side of the story is how much time did she waste in the classroom to give me that second report? Instead of just letting, again, that professional who's doing a fantastic job with my kids, or at least one in particular, just do her job. Yeah. And report out that, hey, my grading practices are sound and they are accurate. And I can tell you how accurately your son is doing the things they know, or the things he knows, and the things that he can do against these standards in my class.
Absolutely. Probably more valid and more reliable.
For sure.
Than some kind of standardized thing that a student can take on an electronic device.
Right.
Because so many of the learning standards are very specialized and performance-based and just can't be done on a computer.
Sure. And I would say, if I was to ask my son, which, I mean, occasionally we have these conversations as, child parent, what are you enjoying about school? The stuff that teacher is doing, immensely enjoy. But then hey, what about those days when you had to do testing? Oh, it was hard. It was long. I didn't like it. So you got to get back to a system that really, again, this is why I think assessment and grading is so important. I think that's why this conversation is important, because it's bigger than just, I'm going to leave that blank. It's bigger than just whatever the audience is now going to fill in. For me, it's about creating the educational system that our kids deserve. And it starts with us. It starts with the bread and butter. Are kids learning in our schools? And are we accurately able to measure that and report that, and then use that data to make impactful decisions about what we do next?
Yeah. Absolutely. What would you say, going back to a teacher who's now they're thinking about this, they're examining, like, does my grading work? What do I need to change?
Yeah.
What's wrong with it? Some examples come to mind, but what would you say are some like obvious red flags that there's something that you should change or update?
Let's just say the skew points, right? So I'm taking late points off an assignment. That's going to skew a grade. I would say if you're using the 100-point system, it's going to skew a grade. And only because we talk about the range mathematically between what represents an A, B, C, D, right? And then when you get to an F, I mean, it's a big range, 59 to 0 in a 100-point scale or 100% scale. So if you have that system, I'd abolish that. And I would start, and I think this is where teachers start to get rubbed wrong, because we hear about practices, the minimum F, meaning an F is an F is an F. And if you get an F on an assignment, I'm going to give you a 50. And teachers struggle with that because sometimes those Fs mean a student didn't turn something in. So I'm giving them 50 points for nothing. But it's that reconceptualization of, but you're really just failing them. And in this mathematical equation, that's still an accurate report. Now, what I do in my practice is, for the 100-point scale, is let's just go down to, and this is talked about in the research too, the 4-point scale, right? So we know GPA, and A is a 4, B is a 3, C is a 2, D is a 1, and an F is a 0. Well, if I give a student an F, whether it's an academic F, meaning they did the assignment but did it poorly, or they didn't turn it in, and I still give them a 0, that's still equitable and fair to me, because the range is 1 point for each, and it's not going to skew their grade. So that would be, again, a skew point. So late points, the 100-point scale, missing and giving a 0 in a 100-point scale. So those would be some starting points for me, is really looking at those practices. And then I think stepping it up would be, okay, well, let's look now. I would even say that's the starting point. If you have late points and zeros and any of those mathematical skewing points, stop doing that. I said then the next step would say, what do my grades, and I think you've said it perfectly today, what do they mean? And so if I'm giving students formative and summative assessments in my grade book, how's that impacting their grade? Especially when I look at an analogy I would give, I'm taking a picture of a student. And so as they're in the learning process and I'm formatively assessing them, checking for understanding in the moment for me to make decisions on what I will do next, but I'm putting that in the grade book. And then over time, I'm kind of documenting in the grade book their progress and then averaging that up at the end. It's going to be messy. And you're going to have a student who in the end, time bound, when they got to that summative assessment, because a teacher instructed them so well, is probably going to perform really well on that end summative assessment. But now you're averaging that end summative assessment with all the messiness that it took to get there, with lots of maybe D's, F's, C's, B's. Oh, now I'm finally at that A and I've mastered the content. Stop doing that. That's going to hurt their grade and the report overall.
Yeah. It's like, so these conversations and different lectures on it and books that are on it bring up things like the driving test.
Yeah.
Like, what if your final driving test at the DMV got averaged with your performance at every single driving school lesson you ever took?
Right.
Like, you'd never get your license.
Right.
And if you fail it your first time, well, if we have to average that with your second and your third time, you're never going to get a high enough score to get your license.
Sure.
There would be far fewer drivers on the road.
Yeah.
Have a lot more public transportation.
Yeah.
That's a really good one to bring up. The 100-point system, I love that you talk about the concept of the minimum F, because a lot of people, experts have suggested if you're stuck in a 100-point system because of whatever reason, that you give a minimum F of 50%. And then the verbiage you used, why would I give them points?
Mm-hmm.
Because that language implies that we're treating the grade like a currency.
Yeah.
And that currency depends on that student, meaning basically behavioral expectations.
Right.
Like, I'm paying you to behave well.
Yeah.
Is what it sounds like.
Yeah.
Is that really what it is? Do you think psychologically with the teachers?
No, I mean, I think it's just that it goes back to also averages, because the teacher at the end of the day is saying, hey, this is where we get into a concept that is called grade grubbing, right? Where students start looking at grades and saying, well, okay, I can get a 50 here and I can get a 90 here. And then they start kind of, and I think research talks about that too, they start looking at it from that, like you said, that currency and that economic way of, what do I need to do to get the product or the end goal that I want? And learning has now gone out the door, right? It's really just an economic game for students. Mm-hmm. And so if we just stop that and say, look, here are the 5 standards that I expect you to learn, and I'm going to measure you over time. And at the end of this grading period, I'm going to give a report, a summative report on how you're doing at this point in time. Let's call it a day.
Yeah.
and not worry about the 50s and giving them points here and getting students to start saying things like, okay, well, I don't have to do this assignment, but I have to do this assignment, or the test is coming, but I don't have to worry about homework. And it gets exhausting for students, and it gets exhausting for teachers to try to figure out how to motivate students in that system. Just remove it.
And it keeps you so busy.
Right.
to grade all that stuff and put it in a grade book and tabulate grades every day and deal with all the late work.
I mean, I would caution, this is now a comment for principals, and I've had principals do this in systems that I'm in, because they're operating under the assumption of the law of averages and not wanting students to have what we would call the grade killer, right? I only have 2 grades in my grade book, and they failed both of them, and now, or at least they failed one of them and did well in the other, and now they have a 50. Like, how do I do this? And there's that grade padding, as you talked about earlier on. I'm going to add more assignments here so it all averages out. Again, that's a skewed grade, right? Because really you're saying I measured their learning on these 2 assignments, and all the other assignments was just documenting where they were at different stages. And it really is just documenting the learning process. But when you have principals that come in and say, to counteract that kind of that pad or that grade killer system and operating under the laws of averages, I've had principals tell me, well, you have to have 18 grades per quarter. You're gonna kill kids. You're gonna drain teachers. And I think mathematically, let's think about this. I'm in high school or middle school, and I have 6 or 7 classes with 18 grades per class per quarter. I mean, that's a recipe for burnout, exhaustion for teachers and students alike. Let's just stop.
18 different graded things in 8 weeks.
Yeah.
You're going to have 18 summative assessments in 8 weeks.
Well, and I wouldn't even say that. I think they're just saying a grade, right?
A grade, which forces teachers to grade formative work.
Yeah, right, which we want to get away from.
Yeah, wow.
And I think too, one final kind of personal story for my older son. He, during the pandemic, got COVID, was out for a couple of weeks. Great teacher who was saying, "Hey, we understand. We're gonna offer him the support. We'll get him back on track." But it was interesting to hear his logic at the end of that 2 weeks going back to school, knowing that he had an F. And I appreciated the teacher accurately reporting that he was failing that class because he had been gone for a couple of weeks. And at the time when she needed to report how the students are progressing, that was the accurate grade. I can't say he's passing my class because he hasn't been here due to the nature of the pandemic. And so now he's going back, and my son says, "Well, I'll be fine, Dad." And I said, "Okay, well, tell me why you're going to be fine." "Well, because I've got this big paper that's due, and I just couldn't turn it in because I was sick, and now, I'm going to go turn it in. I'm going to work on it and go to tutoring and whatever, and I'll turn the grade in, and my grade will come right back up." "Why do you say that?" And then the answer was, "Well, because it's lots of points." Okay, well, let's talk about a teacher just in this situation. Thankfully, his teacher at the time did not do that, but let's talk about a teacher who operates on percentages. 10% is this category, 20% is this category, 50% is this category. Well, my son's just looking at none of that. He's looking at, this is an assignment that's 300 points. Clearly, that's going to get my grade to jump back up. Well, if that assignment, 300-point assignment, was being classified as a 10% category, it would do nothing to his grade.
Right.
And it'd be so self-defeating for a student who put that time and effort in thinking that this was going to improve his grade, that it doesn't. And so I think that's where we get back to another practice of grading, is just have some clarity with your students. Really sit down and say, this is how you're going to be assessed and measured in this class, and go after that so they're clear on what they need to do to accomplish academic progress and academic proficiency.
So the argument for the other side, if I'm a teacher who you're saying that to, and I say, well, if I change the weight of my tests category to be worth more than it is right now, all my grades are going to drop.
Sure.
All my kids are going to have lower grades.
Sure.
What's your response to that?
I think you had the best response. Why? Let's probe into that. Why would they drop? And I think that's okay, because now you're giving an accurate report. If you have all of your students failing your class, that's going to make me start wondering, what's going on with the test? Is the test not accurate? Is there some aspects of this test that's causing some issues for students? And I'll give a concrete example. I teach, when I was teaching in Idaho, here's these kids that are in rural farmlands in central parts of Idaho that have these cultural, not even cultural, but just these socioeconomic references of being out on the farm, working on the farm, pasture, land, etc., having to take a reading test about what life might be like on the beach. They're not going to do well on that test. The comprehension and the inferences and the things that they are being assessed on, they just are not going to do in that context, because half of them, if not all of them, have never been to a beach and just don't have that frame of reference and that prior knowledge. So questions like that, let me look at the way that question was worded. Let me look at the way this assessment was designed and do a really good data analysis of the assessment to determine, again, as I alluded to earlier, even in my own practice, was this assessment sound? And that would be the first reason why my students are failing. Second is, if the assessment is sound, then that's also good. If a lot of students are failing on that sound assessment, then my instruction was poor. And that's not a bad thing to look at and say, I got to go back and reteach that. But just padding the grade has no accountability for those students. You're essentially just trying to make sure a principal or a parent, you're operating under fear of the consequences of what that's going to do to your job, when in reality, if you lied to the parents and principals, you're also not doing your job. Because now these students are, again, operating under the false assumption, so is the principal and the parents, that they've actually mastered the learning when they haven't. And I would rather be on the side of having a principal or a parent come to me and say, hey, my student's not performing well in your class. I know, and I'm going to go ahead and reteach that, versus they never come bother me because they think everything's fine when in reality it's not.
I like that you've brought up the principal a couple times.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you think the role of a school site administrator, building administrator is in this whole thing?
The leader, right? I'm going to just say that flat out. I'm going to go back to that situation. I hope I shared in this podcast, just that a principal charging me to go be kind of a chair of a committee to have conversations with my colleagues about how to change grading practices school-wide, and having my colleagues say no. And what can I say to that? Nothing. And I'm not saying that principals should be so dictatorial either. But I think that's where a leader steps in and says, listen, it is my job to facilitate a learning culture at this school. And as a principal, I'm going to start making some policy-based decisions about the kind of grading practices that I expect at this school. And so that would be one start for a principal to start holding the staff accountable to say, this is what we're going to do, and rally everybody around and have some accountability around that. That's maybe one approach. Principals may listen to this and say, man, you've never been to leadership school. Clearly I have not, but that's my first thought. But then also supporting with very targeted professional development on these practices and ongoing conversations to get people there. I think that's what the principal's role is to make that culture happen.
Sure. What would that, if all you had was an hour, you had an hour with the faculty of my school,
yeah,
of a middle school. If you had an hour with them, what would you do? I
start with the mirror. So here it is. Here's what research is telling us. Well, first, let's start with the presumption. I love this article. I'm going to go ahead and just cite this on the podcast right now. So,
please.
Great article came out in 2019 by Dr. Brad Olson from UC Santa Cruz and his colleague, Dr. Rebecca Buchanan from the University of Maine, made this statement, well, at least cited research in their lit review, which I highlighted and I thought was really great, that research into grading repeatedly found that classroom grades are unreliable. And so I think that's where you start, where you throw up, here's the mirror, and research is showing that there is some inconsistencies between external state measures and the grades that we're reporting, and that needs to be fixed. And so let's take a look at our practices and put up that mirror and have some conversations around that. And I would hope that it wouldn't just be, in an hour it'd be hard to unpack everything. So maybe I pick a couple practices to start and let's unpack it so we get the why should I do that? And then just start letting teachers mull over that, ask questions, and really try to figure out, well, how does that work? I did a PD for a district that I formerly worked in Idaho on this. And I love that the secondary director came up afterwards and said, hey, we've got GPA for athletic eligibility. How does this system work in that? And I think those are great questions. Mm-hmm. And I think these are questions that continually need to be asked about how do I fit these practices into the culture of what we're doing currently as a school? And where does that culture even need to change? Where we say, and that was my answer, that's a great question. And I think you need to have some benchmarks for that. If you say, hey, athletic eligibility requires some kind of a reporting of eligibility at this date, then you need to ask your teachers to then measure student progress at that date in an accurate and reliable and a fair way. And I also would then challenge some of the policies behind, again, academic progress as eligibility for playing sports. Maybe we look at measures more. Are they attending class? Are they being a good student? We look at some of those citizenship-based things because I think that's what really the underlying assumption of athletic eligibility is. Are these outstanding students that are representing the school and traveling to other schools and are just good citizens? But yet we use grades as the motivator, as the behavioral carrot and stick. I just think that policy needs to change, but that's a bigger conversation.
Sure. What about, just to spitball ideas, there's a lot of opportunities in just the day-to-day operations of a school site, of a school building, in which administrators interact with the faculty via a number of media, in-person meetings and email things and communique. Is that an opportunity to model what data reliability looks like?
Sure.
Because I've noticed that in my own practice that, you know, the terms valid and reliable, unless you have a research background, they don't mean much.
Yeah.
They don't, to understand, like, well, is this measuring what we want it to measure? Meaning, is it valid?
Yeah.
Like, does this tool measure this thing? And reliable, meaning if the score is high, does that mean they know a lot and can do a lot? Or if it's low, does it mean they can't?
Yeah.
Just to unpack that, like that's, I mean, data science is its own like area of study.
100%. And my colleagues that I work with, and again, just as a fun researcher to do some of the work that they get engaged in, we're having those conversations. We're asking questions about how do we teach teachers to become data literate. That's a big question mark too. There's lots of good things about case studies, and as you said, let's have some conversations where we sit down and examine school-wide data and really unpack what does this data mean. We don't do it enough. And we're not doing it enough at the pre-service level to get teachers prepared to do that as they step into classrooms. But it definitely needs to happen more.
I love the recommendation.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd say to a teacher who's now thinking like, all right, I've got the summer ahead of me.
Yeah.
What am I going to do?
Yeah, I would say start getting clear on what your learning targets are. I think it goes back to just basic understanding by design. That idea of teaching backwards by design and teaching effectively using backwards by design. We start with learning targets. What am I teaching this year? What am I really teaching? And then start asking yourself questions about the assessments you're using to make sure that or the assessment you're going to use to measure whether students are learning that particular target. And I think if you just start there, then the next obvious question before you ever get to, okay, well, now what am I going to do instructionally to make sure that they meet that, that benchmark? Asking yourself the question, how am I going to grade that? How am I going to ensure that when I assess that student on the assessment I just created, that the grade that I report out is accurate and reliable? And if you start asking yourself questions against this mirror of, well, what if a student turns that assessment in late? What will you do? And if the answer is, well, I'm going to take points off, stop and reassess that. If they turn that assessment in, or if they don't turn that assessment at all, how are you going to feel good about reporting out to parents how they're performing in your class? If they don't do well on that assessment, what's going to be your response? And so I think these are some of the things that we're bringing up. And I'd say start there. Start with be clear in your learning targets, be clear in your assessments, and then ask yourself, in the end, how am I going to report out how my students are doing against this design that I've just created?
I love it. We're at an hour. You want to call it?
Sure. Sounds great.
Okay. Thank you so much, Derek, for coming over today and recording this. I know we've had multiple conversations about it, and we're both impassioned in this area.
For sure.
I appreciate you sharing what you know with everybody that might ever hear this.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you for watching and listening. I hope that you're leaving with something to think about, talk about, share with others, and maybe even ideas to help develop your own teaching practice. To support this project, please subscribe on YouTube, follow on Spotify, and of course, we appreciate all of the likes, reviews, and comments on all of your favorite podcast platforms. I'm Jake Schulke, and this has been the Grand Unified Podcast, a production of Link's Learning Labs. Happy teaching, happy learning.